everybody, it's time to do your next bedtime story. So I'm going to read the first few chapters actually of Holes. It's one of the books we do in year 6 at the moment, and I know it's genuinely one of my favourite books, and I know the year 6 has really enjoyed it as well, so hopefully you will too. So it starts, and the first bit is set into parts, so it's part 1 and it's you are entering Camp Green Lake. Chapter 1. There is no lake at Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago. Now it's just a dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a town of Green Lake as well. The town shriveled and dried up along with the lake and the people who live there. During the summer, the daytime temperature hovers around 95 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade. There's not much shade in a big dry lake. The only trees are 2 old oak trees on the eastern edge of the lake. A hammock is stretched between the 2 trees and a log cabin stands behind that. The campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock, and it belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under rocks and in the holes dug by the campers. Here's a good rule to remember about rattlesnakes and scorpions. If you don't bother them, they won't bother you. Usually. Being bitten by a scorpion or even a rattlesnake is not the worst thing that can happen to you. You won't die. Usually. Sometimes a camper will try to be bitten by a scorpion or even a small rattlesnake. Then he'll get to spend a day or 2 recovering in his tent, instead of having to dig a hole out on the lake. But you don't want to be bitten by a yellow spotted lizard. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. You will die a slow and painful death. Always. If you get bitten by a yellow spotted lizard, you might as well go into the shade of the oak trees and lie in the hammock. There's nothing anyone can do to you anymore. Chapter 2. The reader's probably asking, so why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? Most campers aren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for naughty boys. If you take a bad boy and you make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it turns him into a good boy. Well, that's what some people thought. Stanley Yelnats was given a choice. The judge said, you might go to jail or you might go to Camp Green Lake. Stanley was from a poor family. He'd never been to camp before. Chapter 3. Stanley Yelnats was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver with his seat turned round facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste and a box of stationery his mother had given him. He'd promised to write to her at least once a week. He looked out of the window, although there wasn't much to see. It was mostly fields of hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't air-conditioned and the hot, heavy air was almost as stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend that he was just going away to camp for a while, like the rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend that they were animals at a camp. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have them play soccer with a marble, other times they'd run an obstacle course or go bungee jumping off a table, tied to broken rubber bands. Now, Stanley tried to pretend he was going to camp fun and games. Maybe he'd make friends, he thought. At least he'd get to swim in the lake. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight and the kids in his middle school often teased him about his size. Even his teachers sometimes made cruel comments about without realising it. On the last day of school, his maths teacher, Mrs. Bell, taught ratio. As an example, she chose the heaviest kids in the class and the lightest kids in the class and had them weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boy. Mrs. Bell wrote the ratio on the board, 3 to 1. Unaware about how much embarrassment she'd caused them both. Stanley was arrested later that day. He looked at the guard who sat slumped in his seat and wondered if he'd fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. He'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it was all because of his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whenever anything went wrong, they always blamed Stanley's no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. Supposedly he'd had a great-great-grandfather who'd stolen a pig. The lady put a curse on him and all of his descendants. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course, but whenever anything went wrong, it felt good to be able to blame someone. Things went wrong a lot. They always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked out of the window at the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and the fall of the telephone wire, and in his mind he could hear his father's gruff voice singing softly to him. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, he cries to the moon, if only, if only. It was a song that his father used to sing to him. The melody was sweet and sad, but Stanley's favourite part was when his father would howl the word moon. The bus hit a small bump and the guard sat up, instantly alert. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you needed 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and just a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart, and he had a lot of perseverance. Once he started a project, he'd work on it for years, often going days without sleep. He just never had any luck. Every time his experiment failed, Stanley could hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Stanley's father was also Stanley Yelnats. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yelnats III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yelnats IV. Everyone in his family had always liked the fact that Stanley Yelnats is spelt the same forwards as it is backwards, so they kept naming their son Stanley. Stanley was an only child, as was every other Stanley Yelnats before him. All of them had something else in common. Despite their awful luck, they remained hopeful. As Stanley's father liked to say, "I learn from failure." But perhaps this was part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it wouldn't hurt so much every time their hopes were crushed. Not every Stanley Yelnats has been a failure, Stanley's mother often pointed out whenever Stanley or his father became so discouraged that they actually started to believe the curse. The first Stanley Yelnats, Stanley's great-grandfather, had made a fortune in the stock market, so he can't have been too unlucky. At such times she neglected to mention that bad luck befell the first Stanley Yelnats. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by the outlaw Kissing Kate Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would be living on a mansion on a beach in California. Instead, they were crammed into a tiny apartment that smelled slightly of burning rubber and foot odour. If only, if only. The apartment smelled that way because Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. The first person that finds a use for old sneakers, he said, will be a very, very rich man. This was the latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when he first found out about his great-grandfather being robbed by Kissing Kate Barlow. True, he would have preferred living on a beach in California, but it was still kind of cool to have someone in your family robbed by a famous outlaw. Kate Barlow didn't actually kiss Stanley's great-grandfather. That would have been really, really cool. The bus began to slow down. The guard grunted as he stretched his arms. "Welcome to Camp Green Lake," said the driver. Stanley looked out of his dirty window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. I'll leave it there, and I will carry on again in a week or so maybe. I hope you're all doing well at home, and I hope you've enjoyed this, especially my Year 6s, because we did really like this when we did it in class. So stay safe, and I will see you all soon. Bye!